crashing the mobile house into artillery.
September 4th, 2019. A Nintendo Direct drops, and as per usual, they have a specific one more thing up their sleeve. Aside from the most recent one, which kind of ended on a disappointing note with an extended look at Pokemon Sword and Shield DLC, typically every Direct has a moment at the very end that has everybody screaming their bloody head off in excitement, which makes for wonderful ragged knowledge compilation videos, mind you. On this fateful day, every JRPG fan heard 3 notes, and in an instant, their heart rates tripled. One of the greatest games in its genre of all time was returning to consoles in a brand new engine after 10 years. And finally, a brand new generation would be able to see why such an amazing game was so amazing. And if that wasn't good enough, the final shot presented what many considered to be a pipe dream, the return of the Bionis Shoulder. A long-lost, cancelled area that none had seen legitimately until now. Time would pass, and eventually the details in the return of this lost area would come to light. A brand new side mode taking place after the events of the main game, with the intent to finally complete an arc that remained unfulfilled, and to set sights on future events in the universe. Excitement reached critical, we were but a month away, expectations rose, and Jesus Christ, what a letdown. I mean, yeah, some of the expectations were our fault as a fandom, but come on. Well, oh right, I probably should explain in greater detail.
You are now entering diagnosis. Insanity.
Okay, so let's take a step back for a bit. For those not acquainted, today's video is discussing the side mode in a recently released Nintendo Switch exclusive title, which goes by the name Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. Now, despite my complaints with this mode in particular, I still highly recommend picking up this title if you have the chance. If you're a massive fan of in-depth stories, well-realized characters, actually well-done voice acting, vast open worlds that actually have content to justify its size, awesome art styles, or masterfully composed music, then Xenoblade Chronicles is a game that you absolutely need in your collection. Even if you don't have a Switch, the Wii, Wii U, and new 3DS copies are all still valid ways to enjoy the experience, despite the age of the hardware that runs on them. And please keep in mind that everything I explain here doesn't detract from the masterpiece that is the 100-hour main game. With that said, when developing the original game, the story was actually decided on far later than is usually the case with Japanese RPGs, which you wouldn't think was the case given how well the main story turned out, but as such, one of the largest areas developed unfortunately had to be cut due to the extreme development time required to complete it. The Bionis Shoulder. The status of this area was legendary in the Xenoblade community. It was practically like our version of a virtual Atlantis in terms of how lost and highly sought after it was, despite the fact it was still in the game files, and through hacking you are still able to access it. It is fully modeled, textured, and collision physics have been properly implemented, most of the time. Now over 10 years since the original came out, many fans had speculated on the potential of a remake or remaster since the original Wii release, and all subsequent ports ran on incredibly dated hardware and an extremely antiquated engine, both of which led to ridiculously low render distances, muddy textures, and quite frankly an awful resolution. Now none of these ruined the experience, in fact regardless of which version of Xenoblade Chronicles you play, it remains a beautiful game warts and all, but in hindsight a remaster of this game was practically inevitable. Hell, out of all the Xenoblade fans I know in real life, I was really the only person who actively thought they wouldn't bother because, well, I'm a idiot. But regardless, amongst those remake discussions, the inclusion of the once lost Bionis Shoulder was an often asked request, but not one that was all that realistic in the mind of public consciousness. And yet here it was. These bastards somehow did it. However, that being said, the end result unfortunately didn't come across as good as it could have. Now at this point I'm afraid I can't proceed without spoiling both the base game and the entirety of Future Connected. Whilst I would argue there's virtually nothing to spoil in Future Connected, the main game is still fully worth the price of admission, regardless of which version you play. So if you haven't at least put 100 hours into the original or the definitive edition of Xenoblade Chronicles, then please pause this video and go back and do that. And if you absolutely don't believe that Future Connected has not that much to spoil, despite my warnings, go play that too, although I really don't recommend it. I'm giving you a few seconds to do so. Okay? Done it? So Future Connected kicks off 1 year since the demise of Zanza, where Shulk finds out that the imperial capital of Alchemoth has resurfaced near the Bionis Shoulder, which is coincidentally still floating at the same level it was when it was still attached to the Bionis thanks to floaty rocks or some shit. If you didn't understand a word of that, congratulations, you didn't listen to a single word of the disclaimer, you Drongo. They get shot down by a mysterious laser and discover that a certain population of Alchemoth refugees, as well as a couple of Machina, have made their home on the shoulder whilst they mourn over the loss of their homeland and most of their people. Yeah, it turns out Alchemoth has been taken over by a rift, which has shit out a rather wily bastard by the name of the Fog King. Normal attacks won't work on him until the plot decides they do, so Shulk, Melia, and 2 of Ricky's children, who have actually learned to be far more polite than their father, have to figure out how the f*** they're gonna save everyone on this shoulder as well as get home. Now I suppose you're wondering wondering where this all leads. The concept of a mysterious rift between dimensions seems like a ripe opportunity to expand the Xenoblade multiverse, and the idea of seeing Melia finally take control of her people does seem like quite the tantalizing endeavor.
Well, I'm here to tell you that this results in absolutely nothing!
Yes, I was partially lying when I said there was virtually nothing worth spoiling within this epilogue, because had I actually told you the truth, that in itself would have been a spoiler. In actuality, nothing in this epilogue is spoiler-worthy. The entire story can be summed up with Shulk and Melia show up in a new location, find a unique monster, and kill it. The fog is basically the equivalent of a unique monster. That's it. He exists, and you can't defeat it until you reach a certain point in the story, at which point, without much explanation, you suddenly can. Well, maybe that's not being fair. There is a narrative explanation as to why you're unable to defeat the Fog King at first, but it's so arbitrary you could practically replace it with anything else. Like say Captain Pudraig weakened the Fog King and now you're able to damage it properly. Ultimately, the Fog King just exists because they needed a world-ending threat in their 10-hour epilogue, despite the fact that for a JRPG, that's like making Thanos the villain of an episode of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. However, considering the connections between games, if they had relied on the other universes and all that Hontos bullshit and the Zohan, maybe they could have actually salvaged this boss with some multiverse f***ery. Matter of fact, all the marketing has been quite sly. It refers to the building of a new future, but it never really specifies whether it's the future of the Antiquid dynasty or the future of the franchise. For all we know, the Fog King could be the big bad of Xenoblade 3, although that would probably be the worst final boss of the whole series. But as it stands, the boss exists for a period of time and then doesn't. From a narrative standpoint, his inclusion doesn't really add that much to the story. It spurs a few things on, but ultimately, without an explanation for what he is, there's basically no reason for him to exist. Now, I will mention that as a fandom, myself included, people have probably hyped up the inclusion of the Rift and the Fog King to ridiculous levels. Given these similarities to some later game enemies in Xenoblade 2, people assumed that this epilogue would be another piece in the tapestry that remains the Xenoblade multiverse. So to some extent, yes, the disappointment was amplified due to the lack of being that, but ultimately the failure of the Fog King as a memorable and necessary antagonist stems from the lack of anything, really. Matter of fact, people have been going through withdrawal and attempting to find links to other games within the franchise through the use of the soundtrack. Yes, because they use the Zanza theme for the first phase of the boss fight, people claim that it's some ethereal form of Zanza's essence, despite the fact that he f***ing died.
Stop it. Get some help.
This is what a disappointing boss fight does to people. The irony is, this epilogue already has a viable antagonist that could better direct the story to a satisfying conclusion. Early on in the story, you're introduced to Gael'Gar, who, if you couldn't guess by his design, is the most obviously evil character in the entire franchise. I mean, for Christ's sake, he's even more obvious than Malos from Xenoblade 2. That said, despite his somewhat diminished effect on the story, he does present a few decent ideas. It's well established in the side quests of the main game that the high-entier purebloods are somewhat disgusted by the prospects of interracial relationships. The interesting thing is that in this post-Telethia-sized world, the tables have turned and now those with mixed blood are the dominant race of high-entier. This presents a rather compelling theme of breaking the cycle of cruelty, where the new high-entier are very much in the position to move beyond the previously established paradigm as opposed to just shifting it in a different direction. Matter of fact, there's an exchange in a side quest of this game where one of the high-entier soldiers refers to the Grandel outpost as disgusting Machina traitors. Yes, not traitors in the sense that they split off from the Alchemoth militia, traitorous in the sense of their race. That would have been a really provocative concept to explore. The concept of racism isn't that common in the JRPG genre, so to see this issue tackled even a little bit gets your hopes up for what's to come later in the story. So, how does this conflict end? Gael'Gar f***s off until the endgame section, upon which he sends you a letter knowing where he is, and when you beat the shit out of him, he jumps off a cliff. Not only is this ending so inconsequential that it's relegated to an easily missable side quest, but it's incredibly stupid. Basically, instead of actually resolving the arc, they took Gael'Gar out of the picture in a way where he never actually deals with any consequences for his warped worldview. Aside from violating several guidelines on portraying suicide in media, this ending is just plain dumb. Had Gael'Gar somehow used the Fog King to his advantage in an attempt to have the high-entier assert dominance over the other species, only to realize he'd gone too far, I could have easily forgiven the shittiness of the Fog King as a main antagonist. Given that there's roughly 5 to 7 hours of story within this 10 to 15 hour epilogue, having a somewhat smaller scale villain is a complete necessity given that they have to introduce a new antagonist. They don't have the luxury of already exploring their motivations or backstory over the course of the main game, which is what expansions like Xenoblade, Torna, and Persona 5 Royal's third semester were able to rely on. Now, that's not to say I despised absolutely every element of the story presented. One aspect that I didn't expect to care about as much as I did was the relationship between Melia and Tyrea. I actually did complete Tyrea's side quest in the original game, but even then I wasn't expecting there to be such a satisfying conclusion to her specific arc. arc. In hindsight, Melia's arc required her to find a connection in someone else after Shulk's feelings went straight to Fiora. Not necessarily a romantic connection, but at least someone who would be by her side regardless of the situation.
No, don't you dare! I know what you're thinking, and they're f***ing related! You twisted
Patching up the relationship between the two and putting to rest the wrongdoings that the royal family had committed was actually one of the highlights of the whole campaign. If anything, I wish the entire campaign had been about this and the machinations of Gael'Gar, because it would have delivered a story on par with the rest of the franchise. And can I just say that Tyrea's voice actor, Katie McGuinness, did a wonderful job reprising her role in every scene she was in. She really manages to capture the exhaustion the character faces in this brand new world, and expertly presents the introspection she undergoes when given the chance to finally move on with her life. Through the depiction of this game, Tyrea has gone from a character I barely thought about to one of my favorite side characters in the entire Xenoblade franchise. I wish I could say the same about Melia. Now, I've got no disrespect aimed at Jenna Coleman. She's been fantastic in pretty much everything I've seen her in. Even in the main game, she did a great job portraying Melia's emotions through the purposefully verbose dialogue. But for some bizarre reason, her performance here sounds incredibly phoned in. Now, whilst I'll admit that part of my opinion is based on the fact that they placed literally her worst delivery of any line in both games right in the first cutscene with her very first line of dialogue.
Melia, we're in sight of Alchemar.
All right. I'm on my way. I'm on my way. I'm on my way.
Even though the rest of her lines are slightly better, none of her lines have the same conviction as the original, and even putting that original aside, it sounds, again, incredibly phoned in. I don't believe Jenna Coleman is putting in far less effort in this instance, because in interviews she's always claimed that she was quite fond of the project, even though she never fully understood it. I mean, it's entirely possible that she took one look at the script and then hated every word of it, but I think the voice direction is somewhat the cause here. We'll never know whether it was the director, or interference from Nintendo or Japan, or a breakdown in communication, or something else entirely. Hell, maybe the current apocalypse had something to do with it. Maybe they had to record all of these lines in a video call and only had one chance to do it. But regardless, I really hate to say it, this is easily one of my least favorite performances in all of the Xenoblade games. Yes, that includes Rex. Yes, that also includes Tatsu. The rest of the cast ranges from middling to below average. Most of the NPCs are slightly monotone, but not entirely unbearable. And the new Nopon additions are surprisingly alright. Side note, Nene has quickly become one of my favorite Nopon in the franchise, striking a really nice balance between childlike innocence and mature banter. There is one other performance that stands out as being terrible though, Teelan's. As far as I can tell, he never actually had a voice actor in the original, so there really wasn't any reason to have him sound, well, like a child character in a Godzilla movie dub.
Okay, this should be far enough. I didn't know you all knew Big Sis Tyrea. Ah, Miss Melia.
His voice isn't badly emoted, or at least to the extent of Melia's, but it just sounds incredibly off-putting. Now, whilst most of my issues in this epilogue pertain to the story and presentation of said story, there are issues with some of the gameplay elements as well. Ultimately, I don't find these as pressing as those with the narrative, but I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't at least mention them. Fortunately, the battle system remains largely the same, right down to the Nopon basically being clones of Ryan and Sharla. They do work quite well, to the point where I unashamedly never used Melia once in the entire story. Unfortunately, the map in which this takes place in is just not that interesting. Now, I'm not one to claim that this would have been better off not being released at all, forever doomed to be stuck behind lines of code that required hacking to circumvent, but it just seems like there's something missing. Contrary to popular belief, the success of most of the Xenoblade maps is not only due to their open nature. Yes, they are fairly open in their design, but there's also a slightly linear element to them. You can always tell which point you need to go next, and it adds to the constant push of the narrative throughout the main game. Xenoblade 2 had a few levels like this, but most of the levels were far too directionless. Having explorable areas is one thing, but just having it be a wide open space and making you jump around the map really makes exploration feel less fun. I know it may sound preposterous to ask for more linearity in a JRPG, but the main game struck an expert balance between the two where the second one just doesn't. Also, part of Xenoblade Chronicles' charm, which is present in both the first and the second games, is being able to look up and see the other parts of the body of the Titan you're currently on. Since this map has been converted into a floating island in the sky, you lose part of what made the original game so special. Seeing the Bionis head from the cliffside was what made the Bionis shoulder so special, and whilst removing it isn't the worst thing in the world, and it's perfectly understandable given the circumstances of the story, it just ends up feeling like a hodgepodge that exists somewhere between Gore Plains and Gormott in terms of how difficult it is to navigate. And the one thing that brings it even closer to Gormott is the somewhat wacky collision physics. Frequently, whilst exploring, I'd come across areas that were supposed to be tackled one way, but then the geometry in the environment made it seem like it was meant to be tackled another. The layouts in the original areas were expertly crafted to react to the physics of the original engine, but that doesn't really seem to be the case here. It seems like the developers needed to do some some cleanup on the original in order to get everything to work, but for Future Connected, they sort of didn't bother. I'm not saying that's exactly what happened, but it definitely feels like it. But ultimately, the biggest sin this map commits is the fact that it sadly doesn't fit into the established harmony that the main game had with its gameplay. It's quite understandable that some elements of the progression system had to be removed in order to streamline this into a shorter experience. But thanks to this, exploration incentives are massively reduced. The quest system follows something fairly close to Xenoblade 2 style, but with a tracking system of the definitive version in the main game. It works alright, but honestly these side quests aren't very memorable, are far too short, and don't practically offer much in terms of gear. I'm not expecting something as grandiose as the Red Pollen Orb quest chain in the main game, but something solid is required here. To compensate for a lack of quests, this area is populated with a lot of unique monsters. And I mean a lot. That in itself isn't so bad, but when you realize there's no affinity coin system, they suddenly turn from a fun distraction from the main game to basically padding. And at that point they can hardly be considered unique anymore because you can barely walk 2 meters without hearing You Will Know Our Names. And yes, that song is bloody awesome, especially in its remaster, but anything played that often gets annoying incredibly quick. And whilst on the topic of music, the soundtrack for this endeavor is pretty lackluster, with one key exception. That exception is the fact that finally, after countless complaints, they actually managed to bring back Unfinished Battle, and they allow it to loop properly through the entire encounter. Fucking kudos, Monolith Soft, that was pretty hype. But aside from that, despite the main game having 90 amazing tracks, they end up repeating the same ones quite frequently. You hear Tragic Decision at least 3 times throughout the journey, taking what was supposed to be one of the most somber, and in some cases memeable, songs in the base game, and reducing it to a generic battle theme. And as stated earlier, they kinda just use Zanza's theme as filler music, since they don't really have a unique theme for Alchemoth and the first phase of the Fog King. Beyond that, the new tracks are underwhelming. The Bionis Leg themes, both night and day, are your typical JRPG overworld tracks, which in itself isn't bad, but when compared to the masterful soundtrack of the original, which now, thanks to the remastering of the audio, has not a single bad or forgettable track on it, really pales in comparison. The same goes for the theme of Grandel, the aforementioned outpost of the Bionis Shoulder residents. I think the main issue with these is that they lack a memorable melody that really sets the mood for the area. You can have an infinitely masterful knowledge of arranging, but without a solid melody to evoke a certain emotion, then the memorability plummets. The new battle theme is sadly nothing more than a discount version of the Torna battle theme. Honestly, I struggle remembering it in the context of the game itself. I am able to recall it in relation to the Xenoblade hype meme material that preceded the game's release, but in terms of the game itself, it's pretty forgettable. Fortunately, there's a separate battle theme for some of the new enemies you encounter called Fog Beasts. They're basically infected monsters that go berserk after being exposed to the rift. This battle theme is quite good, and honestly, it's the only good new track in the campaign. The rest is just average at best. Well, that or reused from the main Xenoblade adventure. So ultimately, your time on the Bionis Shoulder is pretty lackluster, but that would have been fine if there were several areas you could explore. Sadly, you're pretty much stuck with it though, as Alchemoth?
Alchemoth? This ain't Alchemoth, it's just Temperantia 2.0!
When you first arrive, you get the sense that aside from being straight up ruined, something else is off. You slowly traverse the area, exploring, and then you realize there's practically nothing to do here. Alchemoth was already a pretty barren area on its own, but post-Mechonis Core it really turned into a fun challenge for those who wanted to see how far they could explore. But now there's nothing! Literally nothing! You've got one Pond Spectre, a countable ally that helps with the replacement of the chain attacks, and one quest that takes place there, and that's your lot. This has to be one of the most barren areas I've come across since Temperantia and Xenoblade 2, and at least that area gave you access to unique monsters and a few quest givers and an actually cool set piece for the boss fight that took place there. Plus that area had a reason to be so barren. They ran out of development time to put everything into it. You can see that half the map can literally be boundary broken in-game, and much like the Bionis Shoulder, everything has been modeled and has collision textures added, but at some point they clearly had to give up. Alchemoth doesn't have that excuse. 99% of it is already modeled from the main game, save for some retexturing and some removing of lift geometry. Much like the Fog King, the tension between races, and the existence of Gael'Gar, what started off as a pretty good idea quickly turned into an underdone mess. And if there were some other areas to explore, I'd understand, but these two are all you have. Maybe if they added the post-story version of Colony 9 tucked away on its island, it could have been far more forgivable. But as it stands, there's just a huge lack of content. Now, I know to many people this may seem like I'm being way too harsh on a freebie that comes with the re-release of a 10-year-old game, but ultimately this is truly what I felt whilst I was playing. The combat still remains as fun as ever, and to a certain extent, completing what little content the Shoulder has is somewhat satisfying, but several elements that make the Xenoblade franchise so endearing just aren't present here. And yes, maybe I was hyping up this experience far too much, so after all of this we do have to give it some concessions. And also, yes, it is completely unfair to compare this to a full 100-hour adventure that takes years and years to develop. It's not fair to compare apples to apple pie, and it's even less fair to compare apples to a hypothetical applesauce formula that may or may not actually exist. But that's when we manage to compare apples to apples, because Monolith Soft have done this sort of thing before, and it just goes to show what Future Connected could have been. Torna the Golden Country was originally envisioned as a few flashback sequences taking place sometime around Chapter 8 of Xenoblade Chronicles 2, but at some point Monolith Soft realized there was enough content to make a fully fledged game. Now, many consider Torna to be a glorified side game, but honestly, if a 25-hour adventure isn't considered a fully fledged game, then I don't know what the f*** is. Right off the bat, you're introduced to one of the most well-realized Xeno protagonists, who's possibly even better written than the protagonist of the game it's based on. Moving forward, you're treated to an adventure that remains completely independent from the main game, although you do get more out of it if you've completed Xenoblade 2. The combat takes a lot of complaints about the previous system to heart and creates one of the most fun systems I've had in any Xenoblade game, period. It's incredibly streamlined, playing very close to an action RPG, and with a smaller character count, they're able to balance the difficulty perfect. The side quests, although lacking the tracking capabilities of the Definitive Edition, are some of the best in the whole series, striking a perfect balance of memorability and plentifility. Is plentifility a word? I don't know. Yes, they do kind of fuck up by requiring you to complete them to progress the story, but it's a small price to pay when the story itself brings you some of the most endearing characters the franchise has to offer. They even have a character similar to Teelan, and despite being completely new to the story by virtue of being a prequel, they still managed to make him far more engaging, and his voice acting doesn't suck either, so that helps. The environment, my god, the environments. Yes, the Gormott Titan isn't as sprawling as it is in the main game, but it's still packed with content, and the Torna Titan itself is amazingly designed with so many varying environments. Matter of fact, it's probably one of my favorite Titans in the Xenoblade 2 universe, and it's one of the few Titans where I've memorized the layout perfectly. And the music, holy f***ing shit, this is awesome. You can instantly recognize a Torna track by its use of the iconic soprano saxophone, and its battle theme is easily the best in the whole franchise. This is what Future Connected tried to imitate, but unfortunately it flat out failed. So comparing Torna the Golden Country and Future Connected side by side shows the fact that there really is no contest between the two. Torna rises above the constraints of the main game itself, to the point where many actually prefer the experience to Xenoblade 2 itself. Future Connected, on the other hand, doesn't really add anything to the table that the other games haven't done far better, and the ending doesn't stick with you thanks to the lack of any explanation or emotional payoff. However, there are still potential reasons why one would proclaim that comparing these two isn't fair. Future Connected comes free with Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition, whereas Torna comes with an expansion pass which can be anywhere from $45 to $60 dues, depending on whether you purchase the downloadable version with the main game or purchase it physically separately. But on the other hand, Xenoblade 2 was a new game, and 80% of what Torna offered was new content that they had to create on top of the core experience. Future Connected already had 1.5 of its maps set up, and only required porting over to the new engine, remake or not. As far as I can tell, they didn't fix any of the geometry, and there aren't any unique enemy models that weren't already redone in the main game, so most of the coding work was already done. They just had to populate it with a better story than the one they presented. Then some will argue that it's not meant to be anything special, just a small bonus for those who bought the main game, but neither was Torna. Torna started as a little bit of extra content, but then it grew into something that, although not as large as its older brother, cemented itself in the hearts of Xenoblade fans everywhere. But maybe it really isn't fair to compare this to Torna, so let's shift gears. Persona 5 Royal offers a brand new experience if you meet certain requirements in the main game, and it actually takes the same amount of time to complete it as Future Connected does, clocking in at roughly 10 hours. Sure, they set up the new characters early in the reworked story, but there was virtually nothing stopping Monolith Soft from doing the same with the main game they were remastering. But if a smaller package to Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition can put something so thought-provoking and evocative in my head, despite being nothing more than bonus content for an older game, well, there's really no excuse for the Bionis shoulder now, is there? Ultimately, it's impossible to be too harsh on Future Connected, as it does come with one of the greatest JRPGs of all time. Despite all I've said, the cartridge you purchase is still worth 100% of what it costs, providing one of the best stories, worlds, groups of characters, soundtracks, and battle systems in any video game, period. Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition is without a doubt just as much of a masterpiece as the original was 10 years ago, regardless of how lackluster Future Connected remains. So with all that said, what can I really say about Future Connected? In the end, all there is to say is that it exists, and quite frankly, it's a waste of time. When going back to get footage for this, I felt like it was a chore. I had to will myself just to keep playing, just to get enough footage. Even watching the cutscenes was boring, whereas rewatching the cutscenes of the main game got me immensely hyped. Ultimately, you shouldn't buy Definitive Edition just for Future Connected, since you really won't get your money's worth that way. You buy this game to replay one of the greatest experiences in the JRPG genre, not the short epilogue after. The graphical, gameplay, and audio additions made to Xenoblade Chronicles are extensive, and unsurprisingly, this has become my favorite game on the Switch. But as far as Future Connected is concerned, well, I don't don't think I'll be touching it again. If you hate the new art style but want to try out this new story regardless, just save your money. If you want to get the story without tormenting yourself with lackluster exploration gameplay, just watch a cutscene compilation. I wish it wasn't so, but in the end, this epilogue provides nothing of value to the Xenoblade tapestry, and I don't mean in the sense of expanding the multiverse. This side game simply exists, and to some that may be fine, but to me, that doesn't really scream Xenoblade.
Don't forget me! 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 Don't forget me!